Good morning. Welcome to Truth for Today. This is Daiqing Yuan, your host and teacher, pastor of Abilene Bible Church. Today we are continuing our study of Daniel, Part 1, a brief history of Old Testament Israel. Daniel is actually Part 1 of our eschatology trilogy on Daniel, Matthew, and Revelation. A brief history of Old Testament Israel, the context of biblical prophecy. The Bible is a history book about how God dealt with man. He started by dealing with Israel, then he dealt with the church. And before there was Israel, there was a time of dealing with all humanity. So generally speaking, we had a pre-Israelite period, which lasted about 2,000 years. And there were four major events: creation, the fall, the flood, and the Tower of Babel. And modern historians, chronologists, scientists have made several events in the Bible into long processes. For example, Creation Week have been extended by a cosmological secular time scale into a 13 billion year process, while in fact it was just the fourth day of creation when he made the heaven and earth and the stars, and then he stretched the universe. So that's why we have this universe now. So you can restore it if you compare with the Bible. And the flood was a one-year process, and right now the geological secular time scale have made it into a 4.5 billion year process, when in fact it was just 1 year process. The geological columns is never in one place. It's just compilation in concepts. It's a construct. And also the confusion of language and scattering of nations, the Tower of Babel, happened as an overnight event. It was in 1898 BC, and right now they have made by a archaeological secular time scale into a 2.5 million years process. But it was an overnight process. So you can restore it, and then all of them were created, constructed to support the so-called biological secular time scale, which is theory of evolution. And it's nothing but a theory. It's a construct. The reality is the biblical record, for God is the only eyewitness of all of those events. And eyewitness record is better than all of the theoreticians that projects back. So we had a creation week, we have the year of the flood, and we have confusion of language. And then we had a call of Abraham. All of this took about 2,000 years. That's the pre-Israelite period. And then how do we know how long it is? The Bible recorded these genealogies. We can calculate them. This is recorded in AU, Anno Universi, the year of the universe. And this is in BC, before Christ. So anyway, we can know that creation was done in 3893 BC. The confusion of the language was 1898, and the call of Abraham, 1876. Okay, after that is called the early Israelite period. And that was a 430-year process. It's also called the Age of Promise. Okay, before then there was an age of, or the dispensation of innocence, the age of innocence, the age of conscience, the age of government, and then and now the age of promise. And that is the early Israelite period, from the calling of Abraham to the Exodus. And in this process, there were four major persons: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And their age have been recorded in detail in the Bible. We can calculate, so we know that from Abraham's exodus from Ur to Jacob's entry into Egypt was 220 years. And then out of the 430 years, the rest of them are called the national sojourn in Egypt by Israel. That's 210 years. This is called the short sojourn theory. The long sojourn theory gave the whole thing to Egypt, while actually the first half, a little more than the first half, was the patriarchal sojourn in Canaan. with a little bit in Haran, 5 years before Abraham entered Canaan. And the national sojourn was just 210 years. So in the first half, there were 4 major persons, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. In the latter half, there are 4 generations. It was Levi, Kohath, Amram, and Moses. God said to Abraham, you shall have 4 generations before I take them out of the nation that oppresses your descendants. Well, that nation was Egypt. And 4 generations are those related to the deliverer, Moses. God was already thinking about who will save them. And then it is by the Jewish tradition that Job, who lived 210 years exactly during Israel's sojourn in Egypt. We don't have better, before we have better evidences, this is where we place Job. So when Moses came out of Egypt, he wrote the 5 books of Moses. He also received and edited and finished book of Job. So there are 5 plus 1, 6 books composed by Moses. Actually, Genesis mostly he was an editor, and Job he was an editor. The rest of them he was the composer. Okay, and for the latter part, which is 210 years in Egypt, we can have a good match with Egypt's 12th dynasty, because we know that their first king, Amenemhet I, was assassinated by his baker and the captain of the guard. Sounds like the situation of Joseph. And also in the second king's, during his reign, Sesostris I or Sennacherib I, during his reign there was a time of abundance, and then they saved a lot of food, and there was a time of famine. It was 7 years. So it matches the time of Joseph. And then later, after some prosperity and war, and then you have a time when Sesostris or Sennacherib III had financial problem. That's why he built his tomb with mud bricks, sounding like the time of Moses. And then shortly after his began his reign, Miriam was born, and her name means bitter. Who will name their daughter bitter unless life is really bitter? That's the starting of the slavery. So how long did the slavery last? 90 years, okay, until the time of Exodus. Well, the last king, Amenemhet IV, he had no son to succeed him after he's dead. Well, that sounds like the 10th plague, when the firstborn of Egyptians were all slain. So this is a good match, and I believe Egyptian chronology had been expanded in time, and it's better to find Egyptian chronology by matching to the Bible rather than the other way around. And after that, it's called the Tabernacle Period. And it is 480 years from the Exodus to the beginning or the founding of the first temple. That's 480 years. And the temple was built in 7 years. And so there are different ways of counting this. And then another way I used to call this period is called the Middle Israelite period, from the Exodus to the kingdom split. So it will have several periods in between. But the most important event that began this period is called the Exodus. Okay, Israel's Exodus was on Friday, Nisan 15th, which was Passover. They crossed the Red Sea, or rather the Weed Sea, on Sunday, Nisan the 17th, which was the festival of the first fruits. So they, in a sense, died and resurrected, because they're supposed to die in water, but they are resurrected because God opened the sea. So this is kind of a prophecy about resurrection. And then they entered the Old Covenant. That means the signing the contract, enter the Old Covenant, on Sunday, Nisan 7th, which was the Pentecost. And this schedule is repeated exactly. For the Israelites, if you have the lunar date and the weekday at the same, it's considered the same day. So the church had its delivery from the slavery to sin by Jesus' death and crucifixion on the cross. That happened on Friday, Nisan 15th, AD 33. It's Passover. And the resurrection of Jesus, it was Sunday, Nisan 17th, the first fruits. So he's the first fruit of resurrection. And everybody who believes in him will have the same result, which is a glorified body. Before him, people who came back from the dead had natural body and they had to die again. But Jesus will live forever, and so shall we. And then the church entered the new covenant at the time of the Pentecost, which is 7 weeks after the first fruits. By definition, that's also a Sunday. So you see the pattern. The entry of Old Covenant and entry into the New Covenant is all on Sundays. And I think that's why the church worships God on the Lord's Day, on Sundays. And the physical kingdom, which is Israel, it's a type for the spiritual kingdom. Therefore, what happened to Israel will happen to the church, but on a higher plane, in a different level. It was physical kingdom before, and for the church, it's the spiritual kingdom. Okay, now let's divide into the smaller periods within the Tabernacle period or Middle Israelite period, roughly equally. So the Exodus and the wandering lasted for 40 years, from 1446 to 1406. And then you have the national conquest, which lasted for 7 years, 1406 to 1400 BC. And then the period of judges lasted for 350 years, from 1399, or the transitional year is 1400, well, the first year is 1399, to 1050 BC. And during that period of judges, you can have these smaller periods. First of all, it's called the early judges. When we had Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, Gideon, and then Abimelech. And actually, the early judges, there are only 4. Abimelech he's less of a judge, more of a nuisance. But anyway, for each of these, there is a time of oppression and a time of peace years for the first 4. In other words, these judges, they rose up when the Israelites sinned and God subjected them to foreign oppression. And then they regretted and repented, and they called on God, and God had mercy. So God raised up a judge. A judge is actually a military officer of sort that they either joined or started a movement to drive out the foreign oppressors. And because of that, they earned nationwide authority or respect, and therefore they became the judge, in the sense that the ancient Israelites who are locally ruled, and they had a family and the clan and the tribe. Each tribe is like a state. It's a semi-sovereign. It rules the issue within itself. But when there are things between them, like like the interstate commerce in the United States, okay, so you have to go to a national level leader, then you go to the judge. In our case, it will go to the federal government, and in this case, it goes to the judge, who has nationwide authority. So a judge is actually military leader in the first sense, but then they become judicial adjusters, more like, because they had the authority and respect. The peace years is not necessarily the time that they ruled. It is the time of the state of the land, that the land had peace because of their work during in the transition from the oppression to the peace years. Okay, so for example, Othniel ruled. He, after 8-year oppression by Kushan Rishathaim, and he overthrew that, and the land had 40 years of peace. And then Ehud, he overthrew the oppression by the Moabite king, and then the land had 80 peace years. It's not likely that Ehud lived through 80 years beyond his, you know, range. Suppose he's in his 20-something, that would make him 100-something. So not likely, but the land had 80 years of peace. He may have died in the middle, but the land stayed in peace until they rebelled again, and God rose up another oppressor to discipline them. Deborah was the only female leader, and then she rose because the males refused to take up leadership. And therefore, there were 20 years oppression and 40 years of peace. And Gideon had 7-year oppression and 40 years of peace. You see, these numbers are round numbers. Some people doubted whether they are real. Well, if a historian writes about history, it's very reasonable if he counts by decades. We often say, oh, the time of the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 80s, 90s. Okay, so it's about the 20th century. We are in the 21st century. So when we talk about the past, not too far away, we sometimes use, generally speaking, the situation of a decade. And then this is just like that. Okay, for 4 decades, the land had peace. And are the dates exact? Well, if you look at the oppression, they are not round numbers. Most of them are not. And the sum of these are precise. Okay? And Gideon was the greatest judge of all of these early judges. And because the oppression during his time was nationwide, there were 2 enemies, one from the north, Ammonites, one from the south, the Amalekites. So it was a nationwide problem, and it was an situation that involves the life and death issue, because there was a famine. The enemies simply rob and take away and loot the grain and the food from Israel, and cause starvation. So Gideon, who solved the nationwide problem about the level of existence for Israel, he got great admiration, and he was given a great honor. Actually, he was given the opportunity to become king. You and your sons rule over us. He declined it, but he wanted the money. So that started his corruption, and we'll talk about that more. So he's a great man. He's a common man made great by God, and later he's corrupted. And after him, his son Abimelech became a real king, and for a very short 3 years, so he himself is the oppression. So after him, the nation was split into the north and south. And therefore, we have the later judges, which are divided into the northern judges and the southern judges. The northern judges are civil judges. They are where the real national judgeship for the resolving disputes between different tribes. Okay? So the civil judges, they are Tola, who judged for 23 years, Jair, 22 years, and then Jephthah, who dealt with 18 years of oppression and 6 years of judgeship. And then Ibzan for 7 years, Elon 10 years, and Abdon 8 years. And altogether, the northern judges lasted for 94 years. You see, most of the northern judges did not have a time of oppression versus peace years. Okay? Only Jephthah dealt with a real oppression, and then he didn't. During his time, the land did not have peace. He just had judgeship. Okay, so we can say that at this time, the situation is not as good as before, and the qualification of these judges are not by their contribution to win back the peace for the land, because they didn't. They just made it slightly better. And the qualification of the later 3 are because of their wealth. The Bible only talked about how many sons they have, how many tongues they own, and how many donkeys they ride. So it is about wealth and power. It's not about good works. So we can say the northern judges were, especially the later ones, were corrupted. They may have bought their office with money. And the earlier 2, especially the first one, may have done some saving Israelites. Tola did save Israelites from what? I don't know. The Bible didn't say it. Maybe from Abimelech. But anyway, that's the total length of the northern judges or the civil judges. That's 94 years. The southern judges is equal to them in length, but in different place. The northern judges, if you look at the tribes, they're all in the north. The southern judges are in the south, which is from Ephraim and south. Ephraim, during the judges period, is the center of Israel. Okay, because they're the two capitals, the civil capital Shechem and then the religious capital Shiloh, were all in the land of Ephraim. So that from there you can divide the north and south. So the southern judges are all south of them. Eli was in Ephraim. Samson was in Dan, and Samuel was in Benjamin, and they're all in the south. Okay? If you add up their years, Eli and Samson's are 40 and 20, 60 years, and then Samuel's can be estimated by matching the time, the total, that's 34. So altogether, 94 years. So these two periods overlap. And after the later judges was the United Monarchy. Let's try not to use the United Kingdom, because these days we have a United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So this is actually the United Kingdom of Israel and Judah. So to avoid confusions, we just use the United Monarchy. That lasted for 120 years, from 1050 to 930 or 931. Okay. Saul ruled Israel for 40 years. And after him, there was a son of Saul called Ishbosheth, real name Ishbaal, the man of Baal. But after the house of Saul lost their throne, this man was called Ishbosheth, the man of shame, by the writers of the history, which is favoring the southern kingdom. So Saul and Ishbosheth, 2 generations, and they ruled for 47 years, well, with actually 5 years, that's interregnum, and then Ishbosheth only ruled 2 years, but they last for 47 years. And after those 47 years, David and then Solomon, the house of David, ruled over Israel. David was king for 40 years, but it was 40 years over Judah, only 33 over Israel. Okay? For 7 years, he ruled from Hebron over Judah, and for 33 years, he ruled from Jerusalem over Israel. And Solomon ruled for 40 years over both Judah and Israel. And the temple was built from the 4th year of Solomon. Therefore, it was founded on 966 BC. It was finished 7 years later, and finished and dedicated 7 years later on 959 BC. So before this time, there was the Tabernacle Period. After the finishing of the temple, or sometimes we're just using the founding of the temple, or it was the time of the first, it's called the First Temple Period. So if we go a little longer until the split of the kingdom, which is at the end of the Solomon's years, it will be called the Middle Israelite Period, in distinguishing from the early Israelite period versus the later Israelite period. The later one starts from the split of the kingdom. Okay, so during these 40 years, we can get more analysis, but I think the time is limited. But just to give you a general idea, from the Exodus 1446 BC to the founding of the first temple, the Bible stated it was 480 years. In 1 Kings 6:1, it says that from the Exodus to the founding of the first temple was 480 years. And from actually it was in the reverse process. Once we know the time of the divided kingdom, then we know the time of the united kingdom, then we calculate back when we know the time of the Exodus. Then we validate it by the time of the coming of the two, the coming of the manna. Okay, the Bible recorded its lunar date and the weekday, and we validate it as accurate. So that's how we calculate the chronologically backwards, but now we're talking about historically. Okay, so from the land distribution after the national conquest at 1400 to the enthronement of David was 390 years. So Gideon was the first uncrowned king. Abimelech was the first illegal king. Saul was the first God-ordained king, but he was ordained after the heart of man, which means according to the will of man, because they want a strong and tall and tall king who was a military leader. Saul was like that, strong on the outside but weak on the inside. David, on the other hand, was the first God-ordained king, but after the heart, or according to the will of God. He was smaller in stature, but he is a good man inside. He's much more spiritual. So that was the general picture. Thank God. Amen.
Dear viewers, I thank you and thank God for making Truth for Today your Sunday morning devotional time. Abilene Bible Church was entrusted for over half a century with this duty of serving the people at home in Sunday mornings in our community, to hear from God about His grace and goodness, about the love of Jesus, and about our responsibilities and wisdoms for spiritual life. The world is getting darker, but the light of Christ shines brighter. Hatred and indifference are taking over the society, but truth and love always saves and heals individual souls. We know that the time of wickedness and evil will prevail, but only shortly. But the second coming of Christ is in sight, and it will correct everything. That is why we love you and we serve you. It is with this assured hope that we minister to you gladly. And we will continue to do so as long as God makes it possible financially. This is a viewer-supported ministry. If you are thinking about supporting us, do so according to the leading of the Holy Spirit and do it gladly. May God richly bless those who give, because their gifts represent not only their love for us, but ultimately God's love for us and for them and for you. And God's love never fails. Let's listen to Him, and love others, and bless this ministry, and through that, bless all the people in our community. Amen.